Every wasteland has an origin story, and Fallout is stranger than almost anything you'll find inside the games themselves. This is a franchise that lost its rulebook a month before launch, killed off its own sequel not once but twice, and got sold for less money than some indie games make in their first week, and somehow still became one of the most beloved universes in gaming. Tonight, we'll be going over shocking Fallout facts to help you unwind and fall asleep. Let me know your favorite thing about Fallout in the comments below, and also where you're tuning in from tonight. Now, with that out of the way, let's jump into the world of Fallout. The game leaked through a voice casting call 2 years before announcement. So long before Bethesda ever confirmed Fallout 4 existed, the internet already had a startlingly accurate picture of what it would be. In December 2013, Kotaku published information claiming the game was set in Boston, centered on a mysterious faction called the Institute, and featured named characters including Preston Garvey, Travis Miles, and Sturgis. The report also correctly stated that the protagonist would begin the story by entering a cryogenic sleep chamber, which turned out to be the exact opening beat of the finished game. All of this surfaced nearly a year and a half before Bethesda's official June 2015 reveal. The leak reportedly traced back to details that slipped out through the game's casting process, since voice actors and studios sometimes let identifying information slip even when trying to keep a lid on a project. When journalists at Rock Paper Shotgun asked Todd Howard directly about a new game announcement in February 2014, he deflected by saying it would be very far away, even though development had already been underway for years. It's a reminder that in an industry obsessed with secrecy, sometimes the biggest leaks don't come from hackers or disgruntled insiders, but from the mundane paperwork of hiring people to read lines into a microphone. The gap between the leak and the actual announcement gave dedicated fans over a year to speculate, theorize, and in many cases, turn out to be right. The studio was 1 point away from a fortune. Obsidian Entertainment didn't just develop Fallout New Vegas out of pure passion. They did it under one of the most brutal contract terms in modern game development. According to former Obsidian creative lead Chris Avellone, the studio's deal with publisher Bethesda was a flat payment with no royalties attached, unless the game hit a specific benchmark. That benchmark was an aggregate score of 85 or higher on Metacritic, a bar that would have unlocked a bonus payment for the studio and its staff. It sounds simple enough on paper, but the actual outcome turned it into one of the most infamous near misses in the industry. When the dust settled, Fallout New Vegas landed at 84 on both PC and Xbox 360. With the PlayStation 3 version trailing even further behind at 82. That single missing point meant Obsidian walked away from one of the best reviewed and best selling RPGs of the generation without a cent of bonus money. Avallone's public comments on the situation, made years after release, sparked a wave of outrage from fans who felt the studio had been shortchanged by a technicality. It's a story that's since become a cautionary tale across the industry about tying developer compensation to a single aggregated number rather than the actual creative achievement underneath it. Downtown DC was once twice the size. When Bethesda first built out the ruined streets of downtown Washington, D.C., the plan was far more ambitious than what players eventually explored. Lead level designer John Burgess revealed in a 2011 GDC talk that the team had originally mapped out 26 separate downtown world spaces, which were eventually cut down to just 12 in the final release. The reasoning wasn't really about disk space or performance, though those did play a role. It was that navigating a full one-to-one recreation of the city made the game confusing and directionless to actually play. Unused encounter zone names still buried in the game's construction kit hint at neighborhoods like Annandale, Adams Morgan, and Alexandria that never made it to the retail release. What makes this cut even stranger is how the team physically tried to solve the problem. Because the downtown area was split into dozens of separate loaded zones rather than one open map, connecting them all in a way that felt coherent became a genuine design crisis. Developers reportedly printed out physical layouts of every individual level and taped or thumbtacked them together on the floor of the studio, trying to piece together a version of the city that actually made sense to walk through. It's a strange visual to imagine, a handful of designers on their hands and knees rearranging Washington, D.C. like a jigsaw puzzle, long before a single line of that geography ever loaded on a player's screen. The game was pitched years before anyone even announced it. So Fallout 76's roots stretch all the way back to 2013, years before anyone outside Bethesda even knew it existed. During the development of Fallout 4, the studio had already started kicking around ideas for a multiplayer spin-off, but those early concepts were judged too ambitious and set aside so the team could focus on the single-player campaign. Around that same time, Jason Hasenberler met with Bethesda executive producer Todd Howard to make a pitch. Hasenberler pointed out that several Battlecry developers had direct experience with massive multiplayer titles like Star Wars Galaxies, and asked Howard to let his studio take a swing at a Fallout multiplayer project. Bethesda didn't say yes right away. The project only got a real green light after Fallout 4 shipped in November 2015, once the main studio had already begun downloadable content for that game alongside preliminary work on Starfield. Executives reportedly saw a Fallout multiplayer title as a way to fill the downtime between major single-player releases, rather than a flagship product in its own right. That framing, treating 76 as a gap filler rather than a tentpole, would end up shaping a lot of the troubled decisions that followed it into development. VATS exists because Todd Howard wanted eyeballs and guts. The targeting system that lets players pause combat and pick apart enemies limb by limb wasn't born from a turn-based RPG or a tactical shooter. According to Todd Howard, VATS traces its lineage back to Crash Mode in the racing game Burnout 2: Point of Impact, where the game shifted into dramatic slow motion to showcase flying car wreckage. Howard has said he pitched the idea to the Fallout 3 team by telling them to imagine the car parts are like eyeballs and guts, and that comparison became the seed for what eventually became the Vault-Tec assisted targeting system. Bethesda needed a way to make a shooter feel like a role-playing game, where character stats mattered as much as reflexes, and slowing time to let players make deliberate choices solved that problem elegantly. One of the system's designers has said the VATS acronym was chosen as a nod to the FEV VATS from the original Fallout, the same tanks that spawned the super mutants players fight throughout the series. By the time Fallout 4 rolled around, the system carried this entire lineage forward relatively unchanged, blending a racing game's love of spectacular slow-motion carnage with a decades-old inside joke about mutagenic soup. It's a strange chain of influences for a mechanic so central to the modern Fallout identity, but it explains why VATS always feels a little theatrical, almost like the game wants you to admire the damage as much as inflict it. The system persisted essentially unchanged into Fallout 4 because the core appeal, letting stats visibly matter mid-fight, never stopped working. Up next, the project reportedly had a brutal reputation internally. Long before critics got their hands on it, Fallout 76 had already earned a reputation inside Bethesda as a project nobody wanted to be assigned to. According to reporting on the game's development, staff described extremely high turnover on the team, with one anonymous developer bluntly stating that the project ate people and that it destroyed people. To keep the team staffed, some developers who had been working on Starfield and on Arcane Austin's Redfall were reportedly pulled over to help finish Fallout 76 instead. That kind of staffing shuffle, borrowing bodies from two other high-profile projects, says a lot about how strained the development pipeline had become. Part of the dysfunction reportedly traced back to a lack of clear leadership on site. Multiple Battlecry developers believed Todd Howard was directly running the project, when in reality, he was primarily occupied with Starfield and only checked in on Fallout 76 periodically. Employees felt his involvement was inadequate given how much oversight the newly merged First Team Online team actually needed. Other testimony described a leadership vacuum where ambitious ideas from the design team were shot down without clear direction, while elsewhere a bigger is better philosophy was pushed with little consideration for whether it was actually achievable. Chandler Bing robbed you in the Vault 21 lobby. Long before most players connected the dots, the smug, charismatic casino owner named Benny who shoots the courier in the game's opening minutes was voiced by Matthew Perry, best known for playing Chandler Bing on Friends. Perry's casting wasn't a stunt or a gimmick tacked on for marketing. His performance is genuinely one of the more memorable pieces of voice work in the entire game. Benny's blend of oily charm and simmering menace gives the character a theatrical quality that suits his role as the story's inciting antagonist. It's the kind of voice performance that rewards a second playthrough once you know who's actually behind the checkered suit. Perry's involvement went largely unremarked upon at the time of release, since celebrity voice casting wasn't treated as a headline feature the way it often is in modern releases. It wasn't until years later, particularly following Perry's passing in 2023, that the wider gaming community began revisiting and celebrating his contribution to New Vegas. Fan tributes and retrospectives specifically pointed to Benny as an underappreciated highlight of his career, given how well the sardonic wit of his sitcom persona translated into a wasteland gangster. It's a strange, quiet legacy for a role that many players spent the entire game hunting down to kill. Did you know that the Metro was supposed to be fully connected? One of the most infamous parts of Fallout 3's map is the sprawling, maze-like metro system running beneath the capital wasteland, and it turns out the original vision for it was even more extreme. Bethesda initially wanted the entire DC Metro to be one continuous, fully interconnected underground network, mirroring the real Washington subway system almost exactly. The idea was rooted in realism, since so much of the city above ground was blocked off by rubble and impassable ruins. The tunnels were meant to be the actual connective tissue linking every part of the map together. In theory, a player could descend into any station and, without a single loading screen, walk clear across the wasteland underground. In practice, the team discovered that realism and fun don't always point in the same direction. Fallout 3 designer and writer Emil Pagliarulo later admitted in a retrospective interview that trudging through miles of visually similar, interconnected subway tunnels turned out to be tedious rather than immersive. The pacing ground to a halt, and the tunnels felt like a chore standing between the player and the parts of the game that were actually interesting. So Bethesda scaled the Metro back into the more fragmented, curated version that shipped, a lesson in restraint that the studio has reportedly carried into every game it's made since. The no NPC decision had two very different justifications. So, one of the most divisive choices in Fallout 76's history was the decision to launch without human non-player characters, a first for a Bethesda-developed Fallout title. A behind-the-scenes documentary about the game laid out two separate reasons for that call, and they came from completely different departments. The lore justification was that the game is set only 25 years after the Great War, and the design team reasoned it would realistically take much longer than that for organized hostile factions to rebuild and take root in the region. In-universe, Appalachia simply hadn't had enough time to develop the kind of settled human population that later Fallout games are full of. The gameplay justification was arguably more pragmatic. The team wanted every human character a player encountered in the wasteland to actually be another real player, not a scripted NPC standing in for one. That distinction mattered enormously to the original pitch for the game. A persistent, lived-in multiplayer Appalachia where every person you met was a genuine unknown. It's a clever piece of world-building logic on paper, but it also left the game feeling hollow at launch, which is exactly the criticism Wastelanders was built to answer over a year later. Mr. House was voiced by a Star Trek legend. The reclusive, screen-bound ruler of New Vegas, Robert House, was voiced by Renee Obazonwa, an actor with a resume stretching back decades before Fallout ever existed. Obazonwa was best known to genre fans as Odo, the shape-shifting security chief on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, a role that made him a fixture of science fiction fandom. He brought that same commanding, faintly aristocratic delivery to Mr. House, giving the character an icy detachment that fit perfectly with a man who has spent 2 centuries controlling New Vegas from behind a screen. It's a performance that manages to sound both paternal and utterly untrustworthy at the same time. Unfortunately, the actor passed away in December of 2019 following a battle with cancer, and his death prompted tributes from across the Fallout development team. Lead designer Josh Sawyer specifically praised the actor's performance, noting that he gave the character a mix of sharp intellect and domineering charisma that elevated the writing around him. For a character who spends the entire game as a face on a monitor, that voice work is doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting. It's one of the clearest examples in the game of a single performance turning a static character into one of the most quoted figures in the entire Fallout series. The Dogmeat was voiced and modeled by an actual dog named River. Every bark, growl, and pant that Dogmeat makes in Fallout 4 came from a real dog named River, who belonged to Bethesda developers Joel and Michelle Burgess. According to Joel Burgess, the team initially researched professional dogs with film or police training to serve as reference material, but images of German Shepherds snarling in attack postures weren't what they wanted, since Dogmeat needed to read as a companion first and a combat asset second. River began visiting the studio and sitting in on meetings, and while she was originally brought in purely for reference, her presence ended up shaping the small team's approach to the character far more than expected. Her natural, friendly demeanor is baked directly into how Dogmeat moves and behaves in the finished game. River was born in November 2007 and unfortunately passed away in June 2021, and her involvement with Fallout 4 was significant enough that she won a Best Video Game Dog Award in 2015 for her performance. Beyond voicing Dogmeat, she also lent her movements and vocalizations to several of the other canines scattered throughout the Commonwealth, meaning a single real dog is responsible for most of the doggish personality in the entire game. When Joel announced her passing years later, he wrote about how her main job at the studio was never just to serve as a reference model, but simply to be present with the team as they built the character around her. It's a rare case where a beloved video game character owes its entire soul to one specific, real animal, rather than a purely fictional design process. Did you know that James was almost turned into a super mutant? The emotional core of Fallout 3's story is the search for your missing father, James, voiced by Liam Neeson, and his eventual fate at Vault 87. But in an earlier version of the story, that fate was almost unrecognizably darker. According to cut content documented from the game's pre-release builds, the player was never meant to reunite with James in the way the final story plays out. Instead, the player would find him already trapped inside Vault 87, in the process of transforming into a super mutant himself. Rather than a tragic sacrifice at Project Purity, his ending would have tied directly into the horrifying FEV experiments already running inside the vault. This alternate version would have completely changed the emotional shape of the main quest, turning a story about idealism and sacrifice into something closer to body horror. It's easy to see why Bethesda pulled back from it. Turning the player's father into a monster to be fought or mercy-killed is a much bleaker note than the version that shipped, where James dies attempting to protect the wasteland's water supply. Traces of this earlier concept remain buried in the game's files and pre-release assets, discovered by data miners poring over unused dialogue and level layouts years after release. It stands as one of the more unsettling what-if moments in the game's entire development history. Radio host was a real Las Vegas legend. Mr. New Vegas, the smooth-talking radio personality who narrates the Wasteland's news between songs, was voiced by Wayne Newton, an entertainer who was already a genuine Las Vegas institution before the game existed. Newton had spent decades as a headlining performer on the actual Las Vegas Strip, earning the nickname Mr. Las Vegas, long before Obsidian ever approached him. Casting him as the voice of the fictional Mr. New Vegas wasn't just clever wordplay, it was a direct wink to players familiar with real Las Vegas entertainment history. His warm, syrupy delivery gives the radio station an authenticity that a generic voice actor simply couldn't replicate. The role clearly meant something to Newton personally, since he later described voicing Mr. New Vegas as one thing in his career he genuinely looked forward to, despite it standing so far apart from his usual work. That sentiment shows up in small ways throughout the performance, including a scripted line where Mr. New Vegas references the Dean Martin song "You're Nobody Till Somebody Loves You," and jokes that he himself is the somebody in question. It's a subtle bit of writing built specifically around Newton's real persona as a beloved Vegas entertainer rather than a generic radio host archetype. Fallout New Vegas remains, to date, Newton's only video game credit, in a career spanning more than 6 decades. Preston Garvey has 2,421 lines of dialogue, more than you'd expect from someone who only says one thing. Preston Garvey has become something of a meme for constantly announcing that another settlement needs your help, but the character voiced by John Gentry actually has a staggering 2,421 lines of recorded dialogue, the vast majority of which players never hear because they avoid his Radiant quest chain entirely. This number comes from data-mined dialogue files that modders have used to build things like the Small Preston mod, which shrinks him down and gives him a chickmunk voice as a joke, using the majority of his recorded lines in the process. The sheer volume of material recorded for a character so often reduced to a single repeated joke says something about how much unseen work goes into even the most mocked NPCs in a Bethesda game. Community discussion around Preston has often centered on whether his voice direction did him any favors, with some players criticizing the delivery as flat or hesitant in his most famous lines, while others have defended John's performance as solid work undercut by repetitive writing rather than poor acting. Preston's actual character arc, as the last surviving officer of the Commonwealth Minutemen after the Quincy Massacre wiped out nearly the entire faction, is far more tragic and detailed than his Radiant Quest reputation suggests. He enlisted in the Minutemen at just 17 years old, and his loyalty to a nearly extinct cause is what makes him hand the sole survivor a general's rank almost as soon as they meet. It's a case where thousands of lines of legitimate character writing and voice work got buried under one repeated, endlessly parodied phrase. Fallout 76 was built for a party, not a prison. Unlike most Vault-Tec facilities in the Fallout series, Vault 76 wasn't secretly designed as a twisted social experiment. It was classified as one of 17 control vaults, meaning its purpose was simply to function as a well-run, baseline shelter rather than hide some sadistic hidden agenda. Vault-Tec gave it the tagline, "Vault-Tec salutes America," and officially designated it the official vault of the Tricentennial, built to open exactly 25 years after the bombs fell in celebration of America's 300th birthday. Its planned capacity was 500 residents, though records list its actual operating capacity as only 88. The people selected to live there weren't random lottery winners either. Vault 76's resident list reportedly included alumni of Vault-Tec University, active duty military personnel, and even a former White House chief of staff. The idea being that these were meant to be America's finest, primed to rebuild the country once they emerged. Construction on the vault itself was a multi-year undertaking, and it used a light-life geothermal system as its primary power source, with General Atomics nuclear power held in reserve. Ironically, this vault, built around unity and celebration, is the one whose opening day the game names Reclamation Day, a title that turns out to be far more optimistic than what its residents actually find outside. Fallout 3 was prototyped using a tabletop system that almost killed the original Fallout. In a genuinely strange coincidence, Bethesda used Steve Jackson Games' GURPS tabletop role-playing system to prototype Fallout 3 in its early development stages. That system will sound familiar to series veterans, because the very first Fallout, made by an entirely different studio over a decade earlier, was also originally built around GURPS before Interplay dropped the license in 1997, and the team invented the special system to replace it. Two completely separate development teams, at two entirely different companies, reached for the exact same public tabletop rule set while trying to get their post-apocalyptic RPG off the ground. It's not clear whether Bethesda's team was even aware of this parallel at the time, since the earlier GURPS history of the franchise wasn't widely publicized outside of hardcore fan circles. Either way, it says something about how naturally the world of Fallout maps onto a stats and skills tabletop framework, even when the developers approaching it are working 20 years and several console generations apart. Bethesda eventually moved on from GURPS just like Interplay did, building its own systems around Fallout 3's real-time combat and VATS mechanic. But for a brief stretch of pre-production, two very different capital wastelands both started life on the exact same rulebook. Veronica and Raoul were played by recognizable names. The Brotherhood of Steel scribe Veronica was voiced by Felicia Day, an actress and internet personality already well known among gaming and geek culture circles by 2010. Day brought a nervous, bookish energy to Veronica that made her one of the more emotionally grounded companions in the game, someone visibly torn between loyalty to her order and doubts about its purpose. Meanwhile, the ghoul gunslinger companion Raul Tejada was voiced by Danny Trejo, an actor whose gravelly voice and tough guy screen presence were instantly recognizable from decades of film work. Trejo's casting gave Raul a weathered, lived-in authority that suited a 200-year-old ghoul who has outlived several careers already. Both actors leaned into their established public personas rather than working against them, which helped ground otherwise fantastical companions in something believable. Day's performance carries a specific kind of anxious sincerity that mirrors her broader reputation for playing awkward, intelligent characters in other media. Trejo similarly brought the same weary toughness to Raoul that had defined much of his film career up to that point. It's a reminder that Obsidian's celebrity casting choices in New Vegas were rarely random. They were built around finding actors whose existing screen identities would slot naturally into the wasteland. Diamond City is built inside the actual footprint of Fenway Park, down to a leftover satellite photo in the game files. Diamond City, the Commonwealth's largest and most prosperous settlement, sits inside the ruins of Fenway Park, the real home of the Boston Red Sox. In-game lore leads directly into this, explaining that the stadium's pre-war tenants were a fictional team called the Swatting Sultans, who was scheduled to play Game 7 of the 2077 World Series on the very day the bombs fell. The settlement's iconic left-field wall, nicknamed The Wall in-game, is a direct reference to Fenway's real Green Monster, the famous towering wall that has stood in left field since the stadium opened. Diamond City's guards even carry padded baseball equipment as makeshift armor, a nod to gear that would have been left behind after the stadium was repurposed. Buried in the game's texture files is a piece of leftover development material, a cropped satellite image of the real Fenway Park and its surrounding neighborhood, internally labeled Test Layout 01. This asset is almost certainly a leftover from very early development, back when the team was still figuring out how to translate the stadium's actual footprint into a playable settlement. According to the Fallout Wiki's source developer information, Nathan Perkypile designed much of Diamond City's layout, lighting, and environmental clutter, and it was the very first location he worked on for the entire game. That's a location this central to the story started as one artist's first assignment, built on top of a real satellite photo of a real ballpark, is the kind of production detail that rarely surfaces outside of wiki deep dives and developer credits. Nearly a third of the game's dialogue was cut for disk space. Fallout 3 shipped as a fully voiced game, which was still a fairly heavy technical lift on 7th generation consoles, and it turns out the final product is missing a significant chunk of what was originally written. According to Bethesda writer Fred Zeleny, roughly 30% of the game's dialogue was cut late in development purely so that all of the recorded voice lines could physically fit on the game's disc. This wasn't a matter of trimming a few awkward lines here and there, it was a substantial percentage of an already massive script, cut for hardware reasons rather than creative ones. What's especially notable is exactly what got sacrificed to make that 30% cut. Zeleny specifically pointed to the loss of most of the dialogue that differentiated between a male and female player character, meaning many NPCs in the finished game respond to the Lone Wanderer in a more generic, gender-neutral way than originally scripted. It's a quiet but meaningful loss, an entire layer of character-specific writing, present in the original script, that never made it past the recording booth simply because there wasn't room left on the disc to hold it. The Overseer abandoned her own vault before it even opened. Vault 76's unnamed Overseer left the vault hours before her own residence did, and the reason wasn't officially explained to anyone left behind. In her parting announcement, she claimed only that she had her own mission to perform in Appalachia, without elaborating further. In truth, Vault-Tec had secretly ordered her to track down and secure 3 still-functioning nuclear missile silos scattered around the region, codenamed Site Alpha, Site Bravo, and Site Charlie. She wasn't supposed to hand control of those silos to any government, militia, or local authority, only to Vault-Tec itself. Her backstory adds an unexpectedly personal wrinkle to that mission. She was originally slated to oversee an entirely different vault, being Vault 101, but her engagement to a man named Evan complicated those plans, and Vault-Tec gave her a choice between leaving Appalachia behind or accepting command of Vault 76 without him. She chose the Vault. Evan, meanwhile, stayed behind in the outside world, and by the time the player eventually crosses paths with information about him, he's been transformed into one of the game's shambling, radiation-scarred Scorched. A Star Trek Klingon voices an NCR legend. Marcus, the super mutant leader of Jacobstown, first introduced back in the original Fallout, returned in New Vegas, voiced by Michael Dorn, the actor famous for playing Worf across multiple Star Trek series and films. Dorn's deep, resonant voice gave Marcus an air of weary authority befitting a character who has survived since the very first game in the franchise. It's a fitting piece of stunt casting, considering Dorn had spent years playing one of science fiction's most recognizable warrior diplomats. His performance threads the needle between menace and melancholy, since Marcus is simultaneously an intimidating mutant and also a tired old settler just trying to keep his community alive. Dorn's involvement is easy to miss unless you specifically dig into the credits, since his voice is heavily processed and pitched to sound suitably inhuman. That processing means most players never realize they're listening to the same actor who spent years delivering Klingon battle cries on television. It's part of a broader pattern in New Vegas where recognizable television and film actors were brought in to voice characters whose faces were often obscured by masks, power armor, or mutation. The result is a voice cast stacked with genre veterans that the average player would never identify just from listening in-game. VAT was inspired by a racing game's crash physics. Fallout 3's VAT system is one of the most iconic combat mechanics in modern RPGs, letting players pause the action and queue up cinematic, slow-motion shots. According to Todd Howard, the inspiration for it didn't come from another role-playing game at all. It came from Burnout 2's Crash Mode, the racing game feature where wrecked cars exploded into slow-motion debris for the player's amusement. Howard has described pitching the concept to his team by essentially telling them to imagine that same spectacle, but replacing flying car parts with flying limbs and viscera. Lead designer Emil Pagliarulo has also pointed to BioWare's Knights of the Old Republic as a secondary influence, since Bethesda wanted phase-based combat that still let a player's stats matter more than raw reflexes. The reason the team needed this kind of workaround in the first place is that Bethesda, as a studio, simply hadn't built a modern gun combat system before. The last time anything close had happened internally was on licensed Terminator games years earlier. Rather than try and fail to compete directly with dedicated shooters like Call of Duty, the team leaned into something stylistically different that could hide the rougher edges of the underlying gunplay. It worked well enough that VATS became one of the defining, most beloved systems in the entire Fallout franchise going forward, even though it started life as essentially a genre-appropriate cover for weaker shooting mechanics. Nick Valentine's voice actor based his performance on Humphrey Bogart, and also voices Codsworth. Stephen Russell, the actor behind Nick Valentine, has said he drew inspiration from the classic hard-boiled detective archetype embodied by Humphrey Bogart, having reportedly watched nearly every film Bogart ever starred in before stepping into the role. Russell has described Nick as one of the most soulful characters he's ever played, partly because of the character's moral compass and the intentional irony of a synthetic detective haunted by human memories that were never really his own. What makes this doubly interesting is that Russell doesn't just voice Nick, he also provides the voice for Codsworth, the sole survivor's pre-war Mr. Handy robot butler, meaning two of the game's most prominent robotic companions share the exact same vocal cords. Russell's connection to Bethesda goes back to Fallout 3, where he became the standard voice for the Mr. Handy robot line after connections from his time at Looking Glass Studios, including lead designer Emil Pagliarulo brought him into his fold. His very first video game role was as Garrett in the original Thief: The Dark Project, and he later reprised recognizable performances in Skyrim as well, making him one of those voice actors whose work quietly threads through multiple beloved franchises without most players realizing it. Players on forums have repeatedly noticed the overlap between Nick, Codsworth, and various Skyrim and Thief characters, often expressing surprise that a single performer's range could cover both a wise-cracking Nord detective and a painfully polite English butler robot. It's a reminder that in a cast this large, some of the most emotionally resonant character work in the game comes from actors doing double or triple duty behind the scene. Yes Man was voiced by a Kids in the Hall comedian. The relentlessly cheerful, endlessly replaceable robot Yes Man was voiced by Dave Foley, a Canadian comedian best known for the sketch series The Kids in the Hall and the sitcom News Radio. Foley's comedic timing turns what could have been a one-note joke character into one of the most quietly unsettling personalities in the entire game. Yes Man's chipper willingness to help the courier seize total control of New Vegas, regardless of the player's actual intentions, works specifically because Foley delivers every line with such disarming pleasantness. The character never raises his voice or shows a hint of malice, even while enabling potentially catastrophic decisions. That tonal contrast, an upbeat comedic voice wrapped around a robot who exists purely to be discarded and rebuilt with no memory retained, is part of what makes Yes Man land as darkly funny rather than simply annoying. Foley's background in sketch comedy gave him the instincts to play the character completely straight, which is precisely what sells the joke. It's a subtler piece of casting than some of the more obvious star power elsewhere in the game, but it's arguably one of the more important performances in the entire story. Yes Man's questline hinges entirely on the player trusting, or distrusting, a voice that never gives them a single reason to doubt it. One Vault runs entirely on an AI's twisted experiment. Vault 51, the setting for Fallout 76's short-lived Battle Royale mode, has one of the darkest backstories of any Vault in the game, specifically because it was never given a human overseer at all. Instead, its residents were placed under the authority of a supercomputer called Zax 1.3c, which was tasked with selecting a suitable leader from among the dwellers. What should have been a simple leadership election spiraled into complete chaos almost immediately, with residents repeatedly voting only for themselves. One dweller reportedly detonating explosives out of frustration with the process, and outright murders becoming common. Rather than correct course, Zax leaned further into the dysfunction. The AI began engineering increasingly dangerous scenarios to force a winner to emerge, treating survival itself as the true qualifying test for leadership. After the last dweller standing was finally crowned overseer, Zax reportedly judged him unfit for the role and locked him out of most of the Vault regardless. This entire scenario, contestants scavenging weapons and eliminating rivals under an AI's watchful, indifferent eye, became the direct narrative basis for Nuclear Winter, Fallout 76's since retired PvP mode. Thanks. Did you know that the VATS camera was first prototyped with action figures? Before VATS was a single line of code, it was a set of literal toys being filmed on someone's desk. According to a Game Informer feature on Fallout 3 Trivia, artist Grant Struthers prototyped the early camera movement and framing for VATS by physically filming his Incredibles action figures fighting each other, using the footage to work out how the slow-motion combat camera should swoop, cut, and frame a kill. It's an almost charmingly low-tech origin for a system that would go on to define the combat feel of an entire generation of Bethesda RPGs. This kind of physical, toy-based pre-visualization isn't unheard of in game development, but it's a detail that rarely survives into the finished product's marketing or promotional material. It also underlines just how experimental and unproven VATS was internally. The same Game Informer piece notes that the system reportedly wasn't even fully functional until very close to the game's actual ship date. What started as a designer filming plastic superhero figures doing battle on a desk eventually became one of the most imitated combat systems in the RPG genre. A whole vault was built just to hide America's gold. Not every vault in Appalachia was built to shelter people. Vault 79 was constructed in near total secrecy for a very different purpose: storing the gold. The United States military reportedly transferred the entirety of Fort Knox's reserves into the vault, with the long-term goal of using that gold to rebuild the nation's economy once the fighting stopped. Unlike most vaults, its stated population wasn't a random cross-selection of citizens either, with records indicating it was designed to house around 120 people specifically tasked with guarding and maintaining the treasury. Word of a hidden Appalachian fortune eventually took on a life of its own after the war, becoming the Great Treasure rumor that draws settlers and raiders back into the region during the Wastelanders expansion. When players and their chosen faction finally breach Vault 79, they find a Secret Service garrison still trapped inside, guarding a literal room of gold bullion. The decision of what to do with that bullion, keep it, split it, or hand it to a faction outright, has ripple effects on the entire regional economy and the balance of power between the settlers and raiders going forward. Ulysses almost never made it into the game at all. The enigmatic courier turned antagonist Ulysses, who eventually became the central figure of the Lonesome Road downloadable content, was originally written to appear as a recruitable companion in the base game before being cut entirely. Writer Chris Avallone conceived Ulysses as the only companion in the game aligned with Kaiser's Legion, meant to be found at a location called Wolfhorn Ranch, giving players a direct window into Legion ideology they couldn't get anywhere else. According to lead director Josh Sawyer, Ulysses was ultimately cut for a strikingly literal reason. He had so many recorded lines of dialogue that they physically couldn't fit on the game's disc, a problem discovered late enough in development that there was no time to trim the material down. Traces of the abandoned companion still linger in the shipped game, including Wolfhorn Ranch's original localized name in several languages, which translates to Ulysses Camp. Obsidian eventually resurrected Ulysses as the sole voice and central antagonist of the Lonesome Road expansion, using the extra development time of the DLC cycle to finally give the character his due. His questline in that expansion became one of the most narratively dense and divisive pieces of Fallout writing to date, built entirely around a philosophical debate rather than combat. Sawyer has since said he considers the loss of Ulysses as a base game companion one of the project's biggest regrets, since Avallone's original instinct that the game needed a Legion sympathetic companion turned out to be right. It's a rare case in game development where cut content wasn't simply discarded, but held in reserve and expanded into one of the franchise's most talked about pieces of downloadable content. The actor who voiced Kellogg didn't know he was working on Fallout 4 until it was announced. Keith Farley, who voiced the mercenary villain Kellogg, has publicly stated that he recorded dialogue for the character for roughly a year and a half without ever being told what game he was actually working on. Farley, who chairs the SAG-AFTRA negotiating committee, used his own experience as a central example during the 2016 voice actor strike against major game publishers, explaining that he would simply show up to a studio, find a stack of scripts with only his own lines on a music stand, and start recording with no broader context. Bethesda reportedly told him only that the project was going to be a big deal and had him sign a non-disclosure agreement before he ever learned anything more specific. This kind of enforced secrecy was cited repeatedly during the strike as a major grievance among voice performers, since actors in almost every other entertainment industry are typically told at minimum what production they're contributing to. Farley's case became one of the most frequently cited examples in press coverage of the strike precisely because Kellogg is such a pivotal character, the man who murders the sole survivor's spouse and kidnaps their infant son in the game's opening minutes. It's a strange irony that one of Fallout 4's most consequential antagonists was brought to life by someone who, for a year and a half, had no idea he was helping build one of the most anticipated games of the decade. The strike itself lasted for months and eventually led to changes in how game studios disclose information to performers going forward. The VAX activation sound is recycled from the original Fallout. There's a small but deliberate piece of audio continuity buried in VATS that most players never consciously register. The sound effect that plays when a player enters VATS and the game shifts into its slowed down targeting mode is the exact same sound used for entering a combat turn in the original turn-based Fallout and Fallout 2. It's a subtle audio callback connecting Bethesda's real-time reinvention of the franchise back to Interplay and Black Isle's original isometric games, even though the two combat systems function in completely different ways mechanically. It's the kind of detail that only becomes obvious once someone points it out, since the sound itself is brief and easy to associate purely with VATS rather than with franchise history. But it speaks to how much care Bethesda's team put into signaling reverence for the source material, even while fundamentally reworking the combat from the ground up. For longtime fans of the original games, that little audio cue functioning as a bridge between two very different eras of Fallout combat is a small but meaningful nod that the new team understood exactly what they were building on top of. A Vault store machine turned its people into something new. South of the Savage Divide, in the Ash Heap region, sits Vault 63, a location that stayed largely inaccessible to players for years after launch. It was finally opened with the Skyline Valley expansion, which revealed that the Vault's own experiment had gone catastrophically wrong. A device built inside the vault generates a perpetual, mysterious storm that blankets the surrounding Skyline Valley region, and exposure to it transformed the vault's surviving residents into a unique kind of ghoul known as the Lost. These transformed dwellers aren't just cosmetically different from standard ghouls. Their voices come out distorted, as if filtered through radio static, and they're described as existing in constant, unrelenting pain. Resolving Vault 63's fate becomes part of the Skyline Valley storyline, with players ultimately helping decide who takes over as the Vault's new overseer once the crisis is addressed. It's one of the more overtly horror-infected Vault stories in the entire Fallout franchise, closer in tone to a body horror short story than a typical post-apocalyptic settlement tale. Fallout Shelter was a surprise release, codenamed Underground, and traces back to a 2009 phone call with John Carmack. When Bethesda announced Fallout 4 at its very first E3 press conference in June 2015, the company followed it with a genuine surprise: a free mobile game called Fallout Shelter that became available on the App Store the moment the conference ended. According to the Fallout Wiki's source development history, the game was internally codenamed Underground during production, and its concept had roots stretching back years earlier. On November 5, 2009, ID Software's John Carmack revealed that he'd had a call with Todd Howard about a potential Fallout iPhone game, and that an internal proof of concept already existed at that point. with Carmack indicating he'd likely be personally involved in the project. Todd Howard has stated that Fallout Shelter drew inspiration from Progress Quest, an absurdist parody game known for playing itself with a minimal player input, which explains the Vault Management Simulator's low-friction, idle-friendly design. The mobile game was ultimately developed by outside studio Behavior Interactive, with Bethesda providing narrative content or questlets to tie it back into the wider Fallout universe. Because the release was withheld until after the Fallout 4 reveal specifically to avoid overshadowing the main event, players got to spend the next 5 months managing their own vaults while waiting for November 10th, 2015 to arrive. It's a rare example of a beloved spin-off existing almost entirely because of a casual industry phone call made 6 years before anyone outside Bethesda knew Fallout 4 was even in development. The Country Roads cover wasn't sung by who you'd expect. The version of Take Me Home Country Roads that plays over Fallout 76's trailers isn't John Denver's original 1971 recording. It's actually a cover commissioned specifically for the game, performed by a New York City doo-wop and R&B vocal group called Spank, working with a production company called Co-Pilot Music Plus Sound. According to lead vocalist Scout Ford, the group landed the gig almost by accident, having been introduced to a producer while performing at an unrelated birthday party who then connected them with the Fallout 76 team. Bethesda's creative direction for the cover was very specific. Todd Howard reportedly asked Co-Pilot to craft something with an Ink Spots-inspired sound, referencing the 1940s vocal group whose music has appeared throughout the Fallout franchise since the very first game. Arranger Ravi Krishnaswamy described the challenge as blending straightforward country harmony with old-school jazz swing without losing the identity of either style. The result was successful enough that it broke Bethesda's usual habit of only releasing soundtrack material after a game's launch, since the trailer's viral popularity demanded an immediate single release instead. Hoover Dam and Joshua Graham were built from a cancelled game. Much of the groundwork for New Vegas's Hoover Dam setting and its NCR Brotherhood of Steel conflict originated years before the game existed, in a cancelled Interplay project known internally as Van Buren. Van Buren was meant to be the true Fallout 3, developed by Black Isle Studios before Interplay's financial collapse killed the project in 2003, years before Bethesda ever acquired the franchise. Several of the designers who worked on Van Buren, including Chris Avallone and Josh Sawyer, later joined or rejoined Obsidian and carried pieces of that unfinished world directly into New Vegas. Kaiser's Legion did technically exist in Van Buren's design documents too, though Avallone has since clarified that the faction his team built for New Vegas was substantially different, with only a single throwaway idea, a slaver named Kaiser mentioned in an old script file, actually surviving the jump between projects. Joshua Graham, the burned man later introduced in the Honest Hearts expansion, is one of the clearest examples of this carryover, since he was originally designed for Van Buren as a companion codenamed the Hanged Man. That original version was explicitly inspired by the DC Comics character the Unknown Soldier, envisioned as a brutally effective but socially difficult ally wrapped in bandages. When New Vegas resurrected the character years later, the team reworked his backstory around Kaiser's Legion rather than his original Van Buren context, but retained the core visual and thematic identity. It's a rare instance of a scrapped project's DNA surviving almost a decade later inside a completely different game, made by many of the same hands. The game's first piece of art predates Oblivion's announcement. Fallout 3's development timeline stretches back much further than most players realize. According to a Game Informer feature on lesser-known Fallout 3 trivia, work on the game actually began in 2004, and it was announced publicly before Bethesda had even announced The Elder Scrolls Oblivion, despite Oblivion releasing first in 2006. The very first piece of concept art created for Fallout 3 was made that same year, in 2004, by lead artist Istvan Peli, and it depicted the iconic power armor image that would eventually become the cover art for the finished game 4 years later. That means the image most people associate with Fallout 3's marketing and box art was essentially the game's founding artistic statement, conceived years before the rest of the capital wasteland existed in any playable form. It's a rare case of a single, early piece of concept art surviving essentially unchanged in spirit all the way to the finished retail product. The game eventually shipped with a team of more than 80 people working across 3 separate platforms, but at its absolute origin, Fallout 3 was one artist and one image of a soldier in bulky steel armor. The song charted on Billboard before the game even released. The Country Roads cover wasn't just a marketing curiosity, it became a legitimate commercial hit months before Fallout 76 hit store shelves. Released as an iTunes exclusive single on July 4th, 2018, the song shot to number 1 on the iTunes singles chart almost immediately after release. It sold well enough within its qualifying window to debut at number 41 on Billboard's Hot Country Songs chart and number 21 on the Country Digital Songs chart the following week, an unusual feat for a sync-licensed cover tied to a video game trailer. All proceeds from the iTunes release were directed to Habitat for Humanity, the international non-profit focused on affordable housing, as part of a charity partnership built around the campaign. Bethesda's senior VP of global marketing, Pete Hines, later admitted he was caught off guard by how quickly the song caught on, noting that fans were posting karaoke videos of themselves singing it within days of the E3 reveal trailer. It's a strange footnote in gaming history. One of Fallout 76's most enduring cultural legacies isn't a quest or a creature, it's an unexpected minor country radio hit. Wild Wasteland exists because the writers couldn't agree on tone. The Wild Wasteland trait, which unlocks a scattering of surreal and comedic encounters throughout the Mojave, exists because Obsidian's own team was internally split over how much silliness belonged in the game at all. According to lead designer Josh Sawyer, some members of the writing staff kept pitching overtly wacky content, while others felt that kind of humor sat awkwardly against the game's otherwise grounded, morally serious tone. Rather than settling the argument one way or the other, the team compromised by quarantining that content into an optional trait players could choose to enable or ignore entirely. That decision let the writers indulge references to aliens, cults, and pop culture gags without forcing that tone onto players who wanted a more consistently serious experience. Selecting Wild Wasteland opens up encounters like a crashed alien ship straight out of pulp science fiction, a hidden reference to the film Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and a variety of other winking gags tucked into out-of-the-way corners of the map. 15 major encounters in total. Because the trait is opt-in, players who want a more consistently serious playthrough can simply avoid selecting it, while those chasing every strange Easter egg have a built-in reason to hunt the wasteland's corners. Chris Avallone has since said he regrets how the trait was implemented, arguing it should have been a toggle in the options menu rather than something that cost players one of their 2 starting traits. It's a rare example of an internal creative disagreement getting turned directly into a piece of shipped game design rather than being resolved behind closed doors. Piper's newspaper is named after the first multi-page newspaper ever published in colonial America. Public Occurrences, the newspaper Piper Wright runs out of Diamond City with her younger sister Nat, takes its name directly from Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic, a real newspaper published in Boston on September 25th, 1690. The real Public Occurrences holds the distinction of being the first multi-page newspaper ever printed in the British American colonies, consisting of 3 printed pages followed by an intentionally blank 4th page, which its publisher explained was left empty so readers could add their own news before passing the paper along. That inaugural issue also happened to be its last, since it was shut down by British colonial authorities within days after its contents offended the sitting governor, and no other newspaper appeared in the colonies again for another 14 years. Fallout 4 confirms this reference directly through its own loading screen hints, which state plainly that Diamond City's newspaper gets its name from the first newspaper ever published in Boston. It's a remarkably specific piece of historical trivia to embed into a supporting character's occupation, especially since Piper's entire arc revolves around using journalism as a weapon against corrupt authority, echoing the exact kind of institutional pushback that ended the real public occurrences after a single issue. Piper's newsboy cap even includes a small piece of paper tucked into the side reading Press, a subtle, visual nod to her profession that ties back to this larger historical reference. For a character whose entire identity is built around uncovering uncomfortable truths, giving her paper the name of a publication that got shut down for doing exactly that feels like a deliberate and clever piece of world-building. Bethesda tried to time the release date around in-game lore. Fallout's canon has always treated October the 23rd, 2077 as the exact date the Great War's bombs fell, ending the world as the characters knew it. According to Game Informer's own rundown of Fallout 3 trivia, Bethesda actually tried to coordinate the game's real-world release date to line up with that fictional anniversary. The game ultimately released on October the 28th, 2008, in North America, close to but not precisely landing on that October the 23rd date the lore treats as so significant. It's a subtle piece of marketing intention that most players would never notice unless they specifically cross-referenced the release calendar against the in-game timeline. The gap of a few days suggests logistical release date realities, things like which day of the week worked best for retail distribution. It ultimately won out over hitting the exact anniversary. Still, the attempt itself shows how seriously the development team treated the fictional history they'd inherited, trying to fold real-world release logistics around a fictional apocalypse that technically happened 2 centuries before the game even begins. The canvas bag controversy started with missing materials that weren't actually missing. Few Fallout 76 stories are as infamous as the Power Armor Edition's bag swap. The $200 collector's edition was advertised with a sturdy, military-style Vault-Tec canvas duffel bag meant to hold the included wearable power armor helmet. When customers actually received their orders, they found a noticeably cheaper nylon bag instead, and Bethesda's official explanation at the time was that unavailability of materials had forced the last-minute switch. That explanation started falling apart almost immediately. Streamers and influencers who had attended a Bethesda promotional event at the real-life Greenbrier Resort months earlier revealed they had received actual canvas bags as part of a giveaway, undercutting the idea that canvas simply wasn't obtainable. Under mounting public pressure, Bethesda first offered affected customers 500 atoms of in-game currency, worth roughly $5 real, as a token apology. That gesture only intensified the backlash, and the company eventually reversed course entirely, promising genuine replacement canvas bags to anyone who had received the nylon substitute. Ron Perlman's narration is a franchise-spanning tradition. Ron Perlman's opening narration and the line, "War never changes," have become almost as iconic to Fallout as the Vault Boy mascot himself, and Fallout 3 continues a tradition that started with the very first game back in 1997. Perlman voices the unnamed narrator across nearly the entire mainline Fallout franchise, appearing in this role in separate Fallout games spanning multiple decades and multiple different developers. That kind of consistency is unusual in an industry where voice casting often changes dramatically between console generations, let alone between entirely different studios taking over a franchise. Fallout 3 also brought in two other notable names for major speaking roles alongside Perlman's narration: Liam Neeson as James, the player character's father, and Malcolm McDowell as the unsettling, artificially intelligent President John Henry Eden. McDowell, best known to film audiences for A Clockwork Orange, brought a specific theatrical menace to Eden's radio broadcasts that made the character's true nature land even harder once it's revealed. Between Perlman's continuity, Neeson's emotional gravity, and McDowell's unsettling charisma, Fallout 3's voice cast blended franchise tradition with genuine star power in a way relatively few games attempted at the time. Making the canvas bags right took Bethesda about 6 months. The canvas bag saga didn't resolve quickly. After initially offering a small in-game currency apology, Bethesda announced on December 3, 2018 that it was finalizing manufacturing plans for genuine replacement bags and asked affected Power Armor Edition owners to submit support tickets by the end of January 2019 to be eligible. Even after that commitment, the actual replacement bags didn't begin shipping to customers until around June 2019, meaning some players waited roughly half a year for the physical item they'd already paid $200 for at launch. The bag fiasco also wasn't the only physical merchandise issue tied to that same collector's edition. The included T-51B power armor helmet, manufactured by Chronicle Collectibles, later became the subject of a genuine consumer safety recall in 2019 after mold was discovered growing on the fabric insert inside certain units. The recall notice affected roughly 20,000 potential units total, though Chronicle later clarified only 32 of the specifically flagged red finish helmets had actually been sold and shipped, all traced and contacted directly. The USS Constitution Easter egg is named after a ship that's still an active, commissioned US Navy vessel today. Tucked into the ruins of Boston, players can find a wrecked version of the USS Constitution, commanded by a delusional robot named Captain Ironsides, who believes he's a colonial-era naval officer in charge of America's entire military. The ship's name and the character's nickname are both direct references to the real USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, because enemy cannon fire was famously said to bounce right off her sturdy oak hull during the War of 1812. According to the Fallout Wiki, the real Constitution remains the oldest commissioned warship still afloat in the world, second in overall age only to Britain's HMS Victory, which is preserved in dry dock rather than kept seaworthy. The real ship was launched in 1797, christened by George Washington himself, and built right there in Boston, where she remains today as a museum vessel and active duty commissioned ship crewed by actual Navy officers, sailors, and Marines at the Charleston Navy Yard. In Fallout 4's lore, the ship was reportedly repurposed before the war as a tourist attraction staffed by robots meant to simulate old naval life for visitors, which explains why Ironsides and his robotic crew are still running the vessel 2 centuries after everyone else died. The in-game quest, designed by Ferret Bordeauxin with input from Emil Pagliarulo, ends with players helping fire the ship out of a building using improvised rocket propulsion, a fittingly absurd twist for a location built on such a proud piece of real naval history. It's one of the more layered historical references in the game, folding a genuine, still-serving warship into a joke about a robot who thinks he outranks the entire Pentagon. Kaiser was once a peaceful historian. Before he became the tyrant ruling over Kaiser's legion, the man born Edward Sallow was actually a member of the Followers of the Apocalypse, the same scholarly, peace-driven faction players encounter as a helpful presence throughout the Mojave. Sallow worked as a profiler and historian for the Followers, studying the various tribes scattered around the Grand Canyon region in an effort to document and understand their cultures. That academic background is precisely what gave him the historical knowledge he later weaponized, since his entire ideology as Kaiser is built on a distorted reading of ancient Roman history he absorbed during his scholarly work. It's a detail easy to miss unless players specifically pursue dialogue options digging into his past. The irony of Kaiser's origin is one of the more quietly devastating pieces of world building in New Vegas, since the very institution dedicated to preserving knowledge and preventing another apocalypse inadvertently produced the wasteland's most brutal conqueror. His transformation from documentarian to warlord happened specifically because he saw the tribes he was studying as too fractured and weak to survive, and decided conquest and forced unification under Roman-inspired law was the only solution. That backstory reframes every appearance of the followers of the apocalypse throughout the game, since players are essentially working alongside the organization that unknowingly trained their eventual antagonist. It's the kind of layered writing that rewards players who bother reading terminal entries and pursuing every dialogue branch rather than rushing straight to combat. The rum bottles had their own separate scandal. Merchandise problems for Fallout 76 weren't limited to the Power Armor Edition. Bethesda also partnered with Silver Screen Bottling Co. to produce an $80 collectible bottle of Nuka Dark Rum, themed around the franchise's iconic soda brand. Customers who pre-ordered the bottle expected a genuine glass container based on how it had been advertised and depicted in promotional materials. When Bethesda released a behind-the-scenes video of the bottling process months after the initial order window, fans discovered the bottle was actually a plastic shell wrapped around a glass interior rather than solid glass throughout. The timing made the backlash even worse, since the rum bottles arrived after a lengthy shipping delay of roughly a month beyond the original estimate, on top of an already damaged reputation from the canvas bag incident earlier that same month. For a game already fighting a narrative about corner cutting and broken promises, a second collectible controversy landing within weeks of the first one reinforced exactly the criticism Bethesda was trying to move past. It's a small but telling detail that two entirely separate physical products for the same game generated two entirely separate consumer complaints inside a single month. Liberty Prime was inspired by the Iron Giant, not Optimus Prime. Liberty Prime, the towering, nuke-throwing combat robot the Brotherhood of Steel activates late in the main story, is one of the most visually memorable creations in the entire game. Despite the obvious naming similarity, lead designer Emil Pagliarulo has explicitly denied any intentional connection between Liberty Prime and Transformers Optimus Prime. Instead, according to the official Art of Fallout 3 book, one of the key inspirations behind the giant robot's design was the Iron Giant, the animated 1999 film about a colossal, weapon-laden robot from outer space befriended by a young boy. The original concept for Liberty Prime was reportedly even more extreme than what shipped in the final game. Pagliarulo has said the earliest plans had the robot being significantly larger than its in-game size, with the idea that the player character would actually ride inside its head to control it, in a style closer to anime giant robot media than anything else in the Fallout series. That version never made it into the finished product, but it's a fascinating glimpse at just how much bigger and stranger Liberty Prime could have been before Bethesda scaled the concept back into the version players actually fight alongside during the Broken Steel expansion. The Strip's casinos are built on real Vegas history. The three major casinos on the New Vegas Strip were each modeled closely on real historical Las Vegas hotels, rather than being purely fictional inventions. The Tops draws heavily from the actual Sands Hotel and Casino, the Rat Pack era establishment where Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr. famously performed, which is why the Tops is run by the chairman and features its own in-house lounge act, the Rad Pack, doing an obvious spin on the real group's name. Gomorrah, the Strip's vice-soaked den of prostitution and gambling, is instead based on the real Dunes Hotel and Casino. An establishment writer, John Gonzalez, has said directly inspired the Vegas mob flavor of its ruling family, the Omertas. That's a meaningful distinction, since it's Gomorrah's faction, not the Tops, that carries the game's most explicit organized crime coding. The Ultralux, home to the secretive White Glove Society, draws its opulence and its dress code exclusivity from the real Bellagio Resort and Casino, which happens to sit on the exact patch of the actual Las Vegas Strip once occupied by the Dunes. That layered bit of real-world geography means the game's poshest casino and its sleaziest one are, in effect, built on the same physical ground a few decades apart. Taken together, the three casinos form a rough cross-section of different eras and reputations within actual Las Vegas history, compressed into a single factional strip. It's a level of research that goes well beyond simply slapping neon signs on a map and calling it Vegas. The sole survivor was the first fully voiced protagonist in Fallout history, requiring roughly 111,000 lines of dialogue. Every previous Fallout protagonist had been a silent vessel for player choice, communicating only through text-based dialogue menus. But Fallout 4 broke that tradition entirely by giving the sole survivor a fully voiced performance for both the male and female options. Todd Howard told The Telegraph that the two voice actors, Brian T. Delaney and Courtney Taylor, spent roughly 2 years recording, with each performer delivering more than 13,000 lines dedicated specifically to the player character alone. Across the entire game, Bethesda has cited a total dialogue count of around 111,000 lines, an enormous undertaking that reflected the scale of trying to give every companion, quest branch, and player choice its own distinct spoken reaction. The lead designer has since reflected that the decision didn't feel particularly controversial at the time, since a fully voiced protagonist was essentially standard practice across nearly every other AAA title releasing in late 2015. The choice remains divisive among longtime fans to this day, with some players feeling it added welcome emotional depth to Nate and Nora's backstory, while others felt it undermined the traditional Bethesda approach of leaving the protagonist as a blank slate for pure roleplay. Bethesda ultimately reversed course for their next original IP, giving Starfield's protagonist a silent, first-person dialogue system instead, which Emil has framed as a direct response to the mixed reception Fallout 4's voiced approach received. It's a genuinely unique experiment in the studio's history, one massive enough in scale that it's unlikely to be repeated in quite the same way again. Liberty Prime's voice actor has never been officially identified. Despite delivering some of the most quotable, propaganda-soaked lines in the entire game, the actor behind Liberty Prime's booming voice has never been officially credited in either Fallout 3 or its later reappearance in Fallout 4. Both the Fallout Wiki and multiple community discussions confirm that Liberty Prime's voice work remains uncredited across both games, leaving the identity of the performer essentially a mystery to the public. Fans have speculated for years about which voice actor might be behind the character, but no confirmed official credit has ever surfaced from Bethesda. This kind of anonymity is unusual for such a memorable and heavily quoted character, especially one who's become a recurring fan favorite across multiple games. It stands in sharp contrast to the game's more famous, publicly credited names like Liam Neeson, Malcolm McDowell, and Ron Perlman, all of whom are easy to find in the credits and press materials. Liberty Prime, for all his over-the-top nationalistic bluster and instantly memeable dialogue, remains one of the rare cases in Fallout 3 where a beloved character's real-world performer is still effectively unknown. Did you know that players caught cheating got a bizarre email assignment? Fallout 76's item duplication problem became one of the game's earliest and most damaging early controversies. Players discovered they could exploit bugs to duplicate valuable in-game items, and some managed to gain access to an off-limits developer testing area that contained copies of essentially every item in the game. Bethesda responded by closing a large number of accounts without prior warning, catching plenty of players off guard regardless of how they'd actually been using mods or exploits. What made the response genuinely bizarre was the follow-up. Many banned players reported receiving emails from Bethesda asking them to write a personal essay explaining why cheating and using unauthorized mod software damages online video games, essentially as a condition tied to their case. This drew significant backlash from the wider community, since a number of the banned players said they had only been using mods to fix graphical or technical bugs, not to gain unfair advantages, and felt they'd been unfairly swept up alongside actual bad actors. Did you know that Australia banned Fallout 3 over a single chem? So in July 2008, months before Fallout 3's global release, Australia's Office of Film and Literature Classification refused to classify the game entirely, which functionally banned it from sale in the country. The ruling had nothing to do with the game's violence or gore, both of which the board explicitly said could be accommodated at Australia's highest available rating at the time. Instead, the board objected specifically to the game's drug system, singling out the chem called morphine, which allowed players to ignore limb pain-based penalties, arguing that its realistic depiction and delivery method brought a fictional chem too close to a real-world controlled substance. To secure classification and release the game in Australia at all, Bethesda made a small but telling change. Morphine was renamed to Med-X for that market, and the visual icons for all chems were altered to be less explicit about how they were used or what they resembled. The change stuck, and Med-X became the item's name in every version of the game worldwide going forward, not just the Australian release. Interestingly, deep in the game's internal files, the item's original editor identification still reads simply Morphine, a quiet artifact of the last-minute rename that was never scrubbed from the game's underlying code. Bethesda apologized with 3 classic Fallout games. As the wave of post-launch criticism kept building through late 2018, Bethesda made an unusual olive branch gesture on December the 22nd of that year. The company announced it would give every Fallout 76 player on PC a free copy of the Fallout Classic Collection, bundling together the original Fallout, Fallout 2, and Fallout Tactics Brotherhood of Steel at no additional cost. It was framed explicitly as an apology gesture tied to the ongoing criticism surrounding the game's rocky launch state. The gesture drew a mixed reaction from the community, with some appreciating the goodwill and others pointing out that free classic games didn't actually fix the bugs, missing features, and empty world that had generated the backlash in the first place. Todd Howard later addressed the launch publicly in a June 2019 interview with IGN, acknowledging the team had anticipated significant criticism given how ambitious and unconventional the project was. He specifically noted that the studio knew we were going to have a lot of bumps, given how difficult the underlying development had been. Ron Perlman did not narrate Fallout 4's opening, breaking a tradition that started with the original game in 1997. Every mainline Fallout game since the 1997 original has opened with Ron Perlman's unmistakable voice delivering the franchise's signature line, "War never changes." Fallout 4 broke that streak. According to the Fallout Wiki, Perlman did not narrate Fallout 4's introduction at all, despite fan expectations built on nearly 2 decades of tradition and despite Perlman's own presence in the game's marketing trailers. Instead, the "War never changes" line in Fallout 4 is delivered by the game's own player character voice actors during the opening cutscene, a genuinely unusual break from a pattern that had held steady across 5 previous entries. Perlman wasn't entirely absent from the game, however. He does appear in Fallout 4's prologue as the voice of a television newscaster reporting on the day the bombs fell, a smaller but still recognizable role that carried into Fallout 76 as well. Steam forum discussions from launch week in November 2015 capture real-time fan confusion and disappointment over this change, with many players initially assuming Bethesda had simply hired a sound-alike before confirming through outlets that Perlman genuinely wasn't the intro narrator this time. In a later interview, Perlman himself joked that his relationship with the franchise has always been oddly minimal despite his iconic status within it, having reportedly recorded the original 1997 narration for a modest fee and a sandwich, and admitting he's never actually played any of the games himself. It's a quietly significant piece of franchise trivia hiding in plain sight, since most players assume simply that Perlman narrates every Fallout intro by default. Private servers had a genuinely strange privacy bug. When Bethesda eventually introduced private server functionality as part of a subscription offering, the feature launched with an odd and fairly significant privacy flaw. Players discovered they had no way to go fully invisible or restrict their private server access to a small, hand-picked group of friends. Instead, the system allowed anyone at all on a player's friends list to see what a private server existed and join it freely, regardless of whether the host actually wanted that specific person included. A separate technical issue affected the subscription service's storage features around the same period. A special crafting material storage box was advertised as offering unlimited deposit capacity, encouraging players to stockpile large amounts of materials there for safekeeping. Some players later returned to find the contents of their storage box had simply vanished, with no clear in-game explanation for where their stockpiled materials had gone, a frustrating problem for a feature that was explicitly being sold as a premium convenience upgrade. The White Glove Society hides a cannibalism plot. Beneath its refined, tuxedo-clad exterior, the Ultralux Casino's ruling faction, the White Glove Society, is quietly working to preserve a taste for human flesh that its members are trying to suppress or indulge depending on how the questline unfolds. The society publicly presents itself as the epitome of old-world Vegas elegance, complete with strict dress codes and a carefully rehearsed veneer of hospitality. Beneath that performance, however, many of its members are the descendants or former members of a tribe with a documented history of ritual cannibalism, a fact the group works hard to bury from public knowledge. Players who dig into the casino's questline uncover this secret gradually, through both dialogue and unsettling environmental storytelling. The questline ultimately gives players the choice to help the society suppress this urge entirely or to indulge and even encourage it, which affects the fate of both the casino's staff and the human meat allegedly being served in its restaurant. It's one of the more effective examples in New Vegas of a location's polished exterior hiding a genuinely disturbing secret just beneath the surface. The contrast between the casino's ballroom aesthetics and the horror underneath mirrors a recurring theme throughout the game, where old-world glamour is repeatedly shown to be a thin mask over the brutal realities of survival. Few side factions in the game manage to be simultaneously so elegant and so quietly horrifying. The Mothman cult is built directly on a real 1960s panic. Fallout 76's Cult of the Mothman isn't just a spooky reference, its entire narrative structure is lifted almost beat for beat from real Appalachian cultural history. The actual Mothman legend centers on a wave of supernatural and UFO-adjacent sighting reports that swept through the area around Point Pleasant, West Virginia, beginning in late 1966. These reports escalated steadily over roughly a year, becoming a genuine local phenomena covered by regional and eventually national press. The real-world sightings came to an abrupt stop after the Silver Bridge connecting Point Pleasant to Gallipolis in Ohio catastrophically collapsed on December 15, 1967. The disaster sent 31 vehicles into the Ohio River and killed 46 people, an awful tragedy that cemented the Mothman's cultural reputation as an omen of impending disaster rather than a simple curiosity. Fallout 76 imports this exact chronology into its lore almost wholesale, giving its in-game cult a pre-war ritual and a looming catastrophe that mirrors the real bridge collapse in both timing and symbolic weight. Did you know that an entire underwater vault with a giant octopus was cut from the game, and its weapon resurfaced in Far Harbor? Buried in Fallout 4's game files is evidence of a scrapped side quest called 20 Leagues Under the Sea, which would have sent the sole survivor into Vault 120, an underwater vault facility located somewhere in the waters off the Commonwealth. According to cut content documentation on the cutting room floor and the Fallout wiki, unused assets confirmed the vault would have included submerged vault windows, an underwater vault door, and mutated sea creatures for players to fight, including a massive sentient octopus stationed outside the facility. Players were apparently meant to fight through these creatures using a specially designed harpoon gun, a weapon whose rough, untextured model still exists in the base game's files despite never being obtainable through normal play. That harpoon gun didn't stay buried forever though. A more refined and fully textured version of the weapon was eventually reworked and included as a real, usable item in the Far Harbor add-on, giving players a small piece of cut base game content in a different, completed form. Some of Vault 120's leftover assets and unused cells even appear to have been repurposed or tested again during the development of Fallout 76's Appalachia setting, suggesting Bethesda genuinely liked the underwater vault concept enough to keep circling back to it. It's a fascinating case of an idea getting cut for scope or time reasons, only to have pieces of it quietly resurface in later projects rather than disappearing entirely. For players who love digging through data mined content, Vault 120 remains one of the most tantalizing what could have been mysteries in the entire Fallout 4 development cycle. Vault 101 wasn't really a control group. Vault 101, the player's starting location, is often assumed to be one of Vault-Tec's more normal vaults, especially since it lacks the outright horror stories attached to some of its neighbors. But according to Fallout lore compiled from in-game terminals and community research, Vault 101 was never actually intended to function as an unmanipulated baseline. Its specific experiment was built around never opening its vault door at all, testing what happens to a population and its leadership structure over generations when there's no external contact and no expectation of ever returning to the surface. That distinction matters, because it reframes the entire opening act of the game. The player's father, James, effectively breaks an experiment that Vault-Tec had designed to run indefinitely, and the Overseer's controlling, paranoid behavior throughout the early game isn't just one man's personality flaw, it's the natural endpoint of decades spent enforcing a directive that the Vault's population was never supposed to question. What looks like a stable, ordinary Vault at a glance turns out to be just as calculated and quietly cruel as any of the more overtly disturbing vaults scattered across the capital wasteland. Did you know a Fallout 76 cultist is named after two actual Mothman witnesses? The attention to detail in Fallout 76's Mothman lore goes well beyond just borrowing the general legend. One of the game's named cultist characters, Stephen Scarberry, is a direct combination of the names of two real people connected to the original 1966 sightings, Steve Mallet and Roger Scarberry. Mallet and Scarberry were among the group of young witnesses in Point Pleasant whose initial encounter with the creature helped kick off the broader sighting wave that made the Mothman famous in the first place. This isn't the only piece of real Mothman mythology folded directly into the game either. The in-game figure known only as the Smiling Man is explicitly confirmed to be Indrid Cold, a name drawn straight from the real-world folklore surrounding the Point Pleasant sightings, where Cold was described in contemporary accounts as an enigmatic, unsettling stranger connected to the wider phenomena. Bethesda's writers clearly did deep research into the specific witness testimonies and side characters of the actual 1960s panic, rather than working from a generic cryptid concept. One expensive recording session changed how the DLCs sound. Ron Perlman's narration is such a fixture of the Fallout franchise that Obsidian assumed getting him back for New Vegas would be simple. But according to Chris Avallone, the studio ran into real difficulty securing him for the project. Perlman had reportedly had an exhausting experience recording the line for a previous Fallout title, where he was kept in the booth repeating the 4 words, "War never changes," over and over for a full hour, only for the production team to end up using his very first take they had recorded. That kind of costly, repetitive session made booking him again for New Vegas a harder and more expensive proposition than the team had originally planned for. Avallone has said that expense is the likely reason the opening and closing narration duties on New Vegas's later add-ons shift to different narrators tied specifically to each location, rather than defaulting back to Perlman every time. Rather than reading as a downgrade, that choice ended up feeling like a natural fit, since letting a location-specific voice bookend an expansion story lines up neatly with how self-contained each DLC was designed to be. It's a rare case of a purely budgetary constraint, born out of one grueling studio recording session, quietly reshaping the structure of multiple pieces of downloadable content. Few players would ever guess that a decision this small in the credits started with an actor being asked to say the same 4 words for 60 straight minutes. Vault-106 drugged its own population as an experiment. Vault-106, tucked into a cave southeast of Arifu, holds one of the more disturbing and understated horror stories in the entire game. According to lore gathered from the Vault's terminals and community research, Vault-Tec deliberately pumped intoxicating, hallucinogenic gas into the Vault's air supply roughly 2 weeks after the Vault was sealed, with no warning given to the people trapped inside. The residents had no idea the very air they were breathing had been turned into an uncontrolled psychological experiment, and the effects on their minds were both immediate and permanent. By the time the player explores the ruins of Vault-106, the surviving inhabitants have been driven into a state of violent, hallucinating insanity, attacking on sight and seeing visions that blur past and present together. The Vault's terminals describe the escalating chaos as the experiment played out, offering an unsettling window into how casually Vault-Tec treated human test subjects as disposable data points. It's one of the quieter Vault stories in the game, easy to miss entirely if a player isn't thorough about reading terminal entries, but it's also one of the bleakest. The cult splintered into 2 factions with opposite beliefs. Fallout 76's Mothman worshippers aren't a single unified group. They're a splintered religious movement with 2 openly hostile factions. One branch, called the Enlightened, reveres a specific, unique Mothman individual with distinctive purple or magenta eyes, whom they call the Wise Mothman, and describe as a benevolent, wisdom-offering messenger rather than an outright deity. The rival branch, sometimes referred to by the Enlightened as the Dim Ones, instead worships red-eyed Mothman as literal divine beings and operates out of locations like the Lucky Hole Mine. This schism traces back to an entity in the lore called the Interloper, who reportedly contacted cult figures like Jeff Lane through some form of telepathic influence and lured a faction of the original cult deeper underground. Those who refused to follow the Interloper broke away entirely and founded a separate church called the Lantern, eventually distancing themselves from the mind-dwelling remainder of the group altogether. It's a surprisingly layered piece of splinter cult world building for a game that originally shipped without any human NPCs to actually voice these competing beliefs. Hardcore mode was built by a tabletop RPG veteran. Lead designer Josh Sawyer, who spearheaded much of New Vegas' design philosophy, has a long documented background in tabletop role-playing games, and that influence is directly visible in the game's optional hardcore mode. Hardcore mode forces players to track ammunition weight, manage hunger, thirst, and sleep, and treats healing items with far more restraint than the standard game. Mechanics that echo the resource management systems common in pen and paper RPGs. Stim packs no longer heal instantly in hardcore mode, instead applying their healing gradually over time, which forces players to think more carefully about triage during combat encounters. That shift alone fundamentally changes the rhythm of exploration and combat compared to the base game's more forgiving systems. Sawyer has spoken publicly about wanting New Vegas to reward the kind of careful planning and resource scarcity found in classic tabletop survival scenarios, rather than the more streamlined action RPG pacing found elsewhere in the franchise. Hardcore mode became something of a badge of honor within the community, with many longtime fans treating it as the definitive way to experience the game rather than an optional side mode. Its influence can be traced forward into later Bethesda-developed Fallout titles, several of which introduced their own survival modes clearly inspired by Sawyer's original system. It's one of the clearest fingerprints of an individual designer's personal background shaping an entire mechanical layer of a major commercial game. A robo-brain named Spencer Lords was meant to be a murder victim in a cut Vault 118 quest called Brain Dead. Vault 118, the ritzy vacation vault players encounter on Far Harbor's coastline, originally had considerably more murder mystery content planned than what made it into the final release. Cut content documentation identifies a robo-brain named Spencer Lords, tagged internally with a form ID beginning with DLC03_Vault118_Spencer Lords, who was intended to be the victim at the center of a scrapped side quest called Brain Dead. While the finished game retains the Vault central murder mystery involving the Overseer's family, this particular character and his associated storyline never made it past the planning stages, leaving only his name and form ID behind in the game's data. This kind of cut NPC is common throughout Fallout 4's files, and Vault 118 specifically retains several other pieces of unused content beyond just Spencer Lords, including character names and AI packages tied to storylines that were trimmed for time or scope reasons during Far Harbor's development. Modders have since gone back through these leftover assets to restore or reimagine some of the cut characters, essentially rebuilding small pieces of content that Bethesda's writers clearly drafted but ultimately never finished implementing. It's a small but telling example of how much narrative material gets generated and then abandoned during a DLC's development cycle, especially for an add-on built around a mystery structure where red herrings and extra suspects would have made obvious sense. Spencer Lords never got his moment in the spotlight, but his form ID preserves the ghost of a more elaborate whodunit that Far Harbor almost included. Tranquility Lane was built by the same man who invented the Gek. Vault 112, home to the unsettling virtual reality neighborhood known as Tranquility Lane, connects to the main quest's most important piece of technology in a way many players don't immediately clock. The Vault's overseer, Braun, is the same man credited as the inventor of the Garden of Eden creation kit, the device the player needs in order to activate Project Purity later in the story. Before the war, Braun served as the director of Vault-Tec's Societal Preservation Program, personally designing many of the social experiments running across the Capital Wasteland's Vault network, including Vault 112's own. Braun's Vault trapped its residents inside a shared virtual simulation using devices called Tranquility Lounges. technically keeping them alive indefinitely inside an idealized 1950s-style fantasy neighborhood. In practice, Braun exploited total control over that simulation for roughly 200 years, repeatedly tormenting and virtually killing the Vault's residents purely for his own amusement before wiping their memories and starting over. It's a genuinely disturbing piece of lore hiding behind one of the game's most surreal and visually charming sequences, and it reframes the man who gave the player their most important quest item as one of the more sadistic figures in the entire capital wasteland. The Mothman Equinox event uses real industrial design for its ritual. When Bethesda finally gave the Cult of the Mothman a proper recurring gameplay event with the Night of the Moth update, they built an unusually specific set piece around it. During the seasonal Mothman Equinox, members of the Enlightened travel to Point Pleasant and drive out a rival group called the Followers to hold a 2-week-long summoning ceremony. As part of the ritual staging, the Enlightened reportedly construct a throne directly on top of the in-game Mothman Museum and rig up industrial fans, sourced from the game's Hornwright Industrial Corporation, specifically to disperse a neurotoxic dust into the air around the ceremony. The Followers, for their part, don't just sit back and let this happen. According to the event's lore, they actually attempt to sabotage the hourly rituals throughout the 2-week festival and try to reclaim the town for themselves once the Enlightened's observance ends each year. It's a rare example of Fallout 76 giving two opposing NPC factions an ongoing, cyclical conflict tied to real in-world geography rather than a single scripted, one-time questline. The deadliest bug in the Mojave came from a single photograph. The terrifying, poison-stinging cazadores that torment low-level players throughout the Mojave exist because Josh Sawyer wanted a genuinely dangerous mutated insect and found his answer while researching real desert wildlife. Sawyer has said the entire creature grew out of a photograph of a tarantula hawk wasp, a real, solitary predator native to the Sonoran Desert just south of the game's Mojave setting, whose sting is famous among entomologists as one of the most painful in the insect world. Concept artist Brian Menze took that reference and scaled it up into something monstrous, and animator Sean Stewart built in small touches, like a visibly throbbing abdomen and constantly twitching back hairs, to push the design further into body horror territory. In-universe, the game explains their unnatural size and pack behavior as the result of DNA splicing experiments performed by the think tank scientist Dr. Boris at the Big MT research facility. Cazadores quickly became one of the most feared low-level threats in the entire game, largely because of their combination of speed, ranged poison attacks, and tendency to appear in swarms around blind corners and canyon paths. Their poison sting inflicts damage over time severe enough to kill an underleveled character even after the initial encounter is ended, making them a frequently cited example of New Vegas's unforgiving difficulty curve. Sawyer has since named the Cazador as one of his proudest additions to the game, adding that he knew from early player reactions to Menze's concept art that people were going to badly underestimate them. Few enemies in the Fallout franchise have earned as consistent a reputation for instilling genuine dread, and it all traces back to one real insect most players never even heard of. The Institute's above-ground entrance is a direct recreation of MIT's iconic Great Dome, complete with a Good Will Hunting Easter egg. The ruins of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, or CIT, sit on the northern bank of the Charles River in Cambridge and serve as the primary surface access point for Institute courses. According to the Fallout Wiki, this location is a direct reference to the real-world Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the CIT Rotunda's design specifically draws from MIT's actual Great Dome, one of the most recognizable pieces of architecture on the real campus. The game even folds in a layer of institutional lore, explaining that the institute itself was founded by former CIT students who took refuge in the college's underground level at the moment the bombs fell in 2077. Hidden at one of the ruins' entrances is a direct nod to the 1997 film Good Will Hunting, which was famously set at MIT. Players can find a skeleton positioned in front of a chalkboard bearing a difficult, unsolved math problem, mirroring the film's plot about a janitor secretly solving advanced equations left on hallway blackboards. It's a small, easily missed detail that only lands if you already know the movie's premise, making it one of those references clearly built for players steeped in Boston area pop culture, rather than a broad, universally recognizable joke. The choice to root the Institute's origins in a thinly veiled MIT analog also reinforces the game's broader thesis about the Commonwealth's history of scientific ambition curdling into something more sinister and secretive. Between the architectural nod and the film reference, CIT stands as one of Fallout 4's most layered pieces of real-world Boston homage. The radio songs ended up more popular than the actual score. Fallout 3's music comes in two distinct flavors: the atmospheric orchestral score composed by Einon Zur, and the licensed, era-appropriate songs broadcast over Galaxy News Radio. Zur spent roughly 6 months on the ambient score, ultimately producing somewhere around 40 individual tracks ranging from quiet exploration cues to full battle music. Despite that substantial effort, critical and fan retrospectives have noticed that the licensed GNR soundtrack, full of genuine 1930s through 1950s big band recordings, has consistently drawn far more attention and streaming activity over the years than Zur's original orchestral work. Part of the appeal is thematic rather than purely musical. The warm, crackling old-world recordings of artists performing decades before the in-game apocalypse reinforce the game's central irony, that the same culture capable of producing something as bright and hopeful as those recordings is also the one that ended the world in nuclear fire. Bethesda leaned into that appeal further by including a handful of these same tracks, alongside select cues from Zur's score, on a bonus promotional CD given to players who pre-ordered the game at GameStop ahead of release. Two very different soundtracks, born from two very different creative processes, ended up defining the emotional register of the capital wasteland in tandem. The Flatwoods monster isn't actually a monster in the game's own lore. So, the real Flatwoods monster legend comes from a 1952 sighting near the town of Flatwoods, where witnesses reported seeing a glowing-eyed figure shortly after a bright object streaked across the night sky. Fallout 76 borrows the name and the general silhouette directly, but its in-universe explanation takes a hard left turn from the folklore. According to lore uncovered by Vault 76 expeditioners, the creature isn't a monster or a cryptid at all. It's actually a Zetan, the Fallout franchise's established name for extraterrestrials, functioning as a scout for a larger alien invasion fleet quietly observing humanity. That reframing turns a classic piece of 1950s small-town folklore into full-blown Fallout-style science fiction. In the game's backstory, those alien scouts were using their observations to determine the ideal moment to strike, and the monster sightings both before and after the Great War were really just glimpses of that reconnaissance mission. The invasion eventually comes to a head in the Invaders from Beyond update, where the Zetan fleet launches an actual assault on Appalachia that the Vault dwellers have to repel directly. The Divide was built around a courier's guild. The Lonesome Road expansion introduces players to the Divide, a devastated region torn apart by a catastrophic detonation of leftover pre-war warheads, an event directly tied to the courier's own past actions. According to the expansion's narrative, the player character delivered a package years earlier that ultimately triggered the region's destruction, a fact Ulysses spends the entire DLC forcing the courier to confront directly. That framing turns Lonesome Road into something structurally different from the rest of New Vegas, since it's less concerned with faction politics and more focused on a direct philosophical and emotional reckoning between two characters. The environmental design throughout the Divide, all cracked earth and buried missiles, was built specifically to reflect that history visually rather than simply providing a new combat backdrop. Ulysses' dialogue throughout the expansion functions almost like an extended argument rather than a traditional quest structure, forcing players to sit through lengthy philosophical monologues about fate, destruction, and responsibility. That density of writing made Lonesome Road one of the more divisive pieces of downloadable content among fans, since it trades much of the open exploration found elsewhere in the game for a tightly controlled, linear narrative experience. Critics and fans alike have pointed to it as some of the most ambitious writing in the entire Fallout franchise, precisely because it's willing to slow down and let two characters simply talk through their history. It stands as a clear example of Obsidian using the extra development runway of a DLC cycle to attempt something structurally riskier than the base game could support. The Grafton monster has a specific real-world witness behind it. Where the Mothman legend draws from a whole community of witnesses, the real Grafton monster story is tied specifically to one reported sighting. According to the account, a young newspaper reporter named Robert Cockrell was driving home along Riverside Drive near the Tygart River in Grafton, West Virginia, at around 11 p.m., when his headlights caught what he initially assumed was debris on the roadside. He quickly realized it wasn't an object at all, but a large, pale creature standing 7 to 9 feet tall and roughly 4 feet wide, unlike anything he'd encountered before. Fallout 76 folds this exact regional legend into the bestiary as the Grafton Monster, one of several cryptid-type enemies scattered around the map alongside Mothman, the Flatwoods Monster, and the Wendigo. Unlike the reframed extraterrestrial explanation given to the Flatwoods Monster, the Grafton Monster in-game stays closer to its folkloric roots as an unexplained mutant beast rather than getting a deep science fiction backstory of its own. It's a good example of how unevenly Bethesda chose to expand on different regional cryptids, giving some elaborate in-universe explanations and leaving others intentionally mysterious. Nuka World sits on the same real-world location as an actual New England amusement park. The Nuka World add-on, released as Fallout 4's sixth and final expansion in August 2016, is set at a fictional Nuka-Cola branded amusement park located in Springfield, Massachusetts. According to the Fallout Wiki, this in-game location roughly corresponds to the real-world site of Six Flags New England, an actual operating amusement park that sits in that same general area of Massachusetts today. The fictional park's history is detailed extensively through in-game loading screens and terminal entries, tracing its opening in 1950 through several subsequent expansions, including Dry Rock Gulch in 1958 and the Galactic Zone in 1972, right up until the Great War ended its operations for good. Nuka World's opening day reportedly sold over 40,000 tickets, according to its own in-universe history, and its layout of themed subparks, Kiddie Kingdom, Dry Rock Gulch, Safari Adventure, and the Galactic Zone mirrors the real-world structure of large multi-zone amusement parks that expanded over decades by adding new themed areas onto an original core attraction. Placing the fictional park in the exact geographic footprint of a real, still operating amusement park is a clever bit of world building that ties the DLC's setting to something players from the region can genuinely visit and compare against. It also means that Nuka World's transformation from a beloved family destination into a raider-controlled fortress carries an extra layer of unsettling familiarity for anyone who's actually spent a summer day at the real park nearby. Bethesda's tendency to root its fictional Commonwealth locations in real Massachusetts geography extends well beyond downtown Vault 108 deliberately chose a dying overseer to study succession. So, Vault 108 is now infamous among players for being overrun by an army of identical hostile clones all named Gary. But the Vault's original purpose was considerably more calculated. According to lore compiled from in-game sources, Vault-Tec scientists deliberately selected a man already suffering from cancer to serve as the Vault's overseer, estimating he would die roughly 3 years after the Vault was sealed. The intention was to study how a leadership succession crisis would unfold once that inevitable death occurred, with the Vault stocked accordingly with an abundance of weaponry and virtually no entertainment to keep tensions high. While the population waited for the Overseer's death and the resulting power struggle, a separate strand of the experiment was already running in parallel: repeated cloning of a single test subject named Gary, to observe what happened when one man was duplicated over and over inside a closed environment. The results were far more violent than Vault-Tec anticipated, with each successive Gary clone displaying stronger aggressive tendencies toward anyone who wasn't also a clone. By the time players reached the Vault, the original social experiment has collapsed entirely into a sealed environment overrun by nothing but hostile, identical men, every one of them named Gary, and every one of them ready to attack on sight. Dead Money's gold bars are a joke about worthless currency. The Sierra Madre Casino at the center of the Dead Money expansion rewards players with heavy gold bars as its ultimate treasure, a reward that becomes a pointed piece of dark irony once players actually try to use it. Gold, once the ultimate symbol of pre-war wealth, holds essentially no practical value in the post-apocalyptic economy of the Mojave, where bottle caps and NCR script serve as the actual functioning currency. Selling the gold bars back in the main game requires finding merchants with enough available caps to make the transaction worthwhile at all, and even then, the payout is nowhere near what the bar's fictional pre-war value would have suggested. That mismatch between the treasure's narrative weight and its actual gameplay usefulness is entirely intentional on the part of the writers. The joke works because it mirrors the expansion's broader themes about the emptiness of pre-war greed and the false promises made by the casino's original owners. Elijah, the expansion's antagonist, spends the entire questline obsessed with the Vault's treasure, despite the wasteland around him having already moved past gold as a meaningful measure of wealth. Players who rush toward the Sierra Madre expecting a life-changing jackpot are met instead with a pointed commentary on how quickly old-world value systems collapse once civilization itself collapses. It's one of the more subtle pieces of thematic irony buried inside what otherwise plays like a straightforward heist narrative. The White Spring Resort is a near-direct recreation of a real landmark. Fallout 76's White Spring Resort, one of the most visually striking locations on the entire map, is modeled closely on the real-life Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. The actual Greenbrier has operated as a luxury resort for centuries and has had a documented relationship with the United States government dating back to 1941, when it began being used as a retreat for government officials and later as a wartime facility. That real history of quiet, high-level government use lines up conspicuously well with the in-game White Springs' own secret bunker storyline. Because the connection between the two locations is so well known regionally, the real Greenbrier Resort has leaned into the association rather than avoiding it, with local tourism materials in West Virginia explicitly promoting the site as a Fallout 76 landmark for visiting players. Officials from the West Virginia Explorer publication reportedly met with Bethesda developers directly at the Greenbrier itself to confirm which specific in-game locations were drawn from which real sites, suggesting the connection wasn't just a coincidental resemblance but an intentional, closely tracked piece of regional world building. Fallout 4's 6 DLCs released once a month for 6 consecutive months, an unusually tight schedule. Fallout 4's add-on content followed one of the most aggressive release schedules of any modern Bethesda game, with all 6 expansions launching once a month from March through August of 2016. Automatron arrived first on March 22nd, followed by Wasteland Workshop on April the 12th, Far Harbor on May the 19th, Contraptions Workshop on June 21st, Vault-Tec Workshop on July 26th, and finally Nuka World on August the 30th, closing out the DLC cycle roughly 10 months after the base game's original release. According to Wikipedia's documentation of the DLC lineup, Far Harbor stands as the largest expansion in terms of actual gameplay content, offering an entirely new landmass, faction system, and quest chain, while Nuka World holds the distinction of being the largest in raw file size. This monthly cadence meant Fallout 4 essentially received new, paid content every few weeks for half a year, a pace that stands in contrast to the more sporadic, unpredictable DLC schedules the series had followed with earlier entries like Fallout 3 and New Vegas. The rhythm also meant that smaller, gameplay-focused add-ons like Wasteland Workshop and Contraptions Workshop, which added creature cages and mechanical building pieces rather than new quests, were deliberately interspersed between the 2 major story expansions, Far Harbor and Nuka World, to keep the release calendar consistently active. Critical reception varied significantly across the lineup, with some of the workshop-focused add-ons receiving more mixed reviews than the quest-driven content, reflecting how differently these smaller mechanical expansions landed compared to Far Harbor's substantial new setting. It's a scheduling decision that shaped how players experienced the game's first year on the market, turning post-launch support into something closer to a season pass rhythm than a series of surprise announcements. Did you know that Fallout 3 only had one concept artist? So, given the scale and visual density of the capital wasteland, it comes as a surprise to many players that Fallout 3's concept art was produced by a single person. Adam Wojcik served as the sole concept artist working on Fallout 3, a role he'd go on to repeat on The Elder Scrolls Skyrim, where he worked alongside just one additional artist. Adam had previously contributed to Oblivion as well, meaning one artist's visual sensibility quietly shaped the identity of 3 of Bethesda's most significant releases in a row. Adam drew heavily on 1950s American art and advertising aesthetics to build Fallout 3's retro-futuristic look, blending genuine period charm with the grim reality of a nuclear wasteland underneath it. Tragically, Adam passed away in February 2012 at just 43 years old, following complications from lung cancer, only a few years after Fallout 3's release and shortly before Skyrim's full impact on the industry had fully settled in. His influence on the visual identity of modern Bethesda games, however, continued well past his death, with some of his concept work even informing the visual direction of Fallout 4 years later. Honest Hearts draws directly from Mormon pioneer history. The Honest Hearts expansion, centered around the isolated community of New Canaan and its Mormon-descended settlers, draws heavily on real historical details from actual Latter-day Saint pioneer migration across the American West. The in-game New Canaanites are explicitly framed as descendants of real-world Mormon settlers who continued practicing their faith after the war, complete with references to actual historical figures and geography tied to the westward Mormon migration of the 19th century. Zion Canyon, the expansion's primary setting, is modeled directly after the real Zion National Park in Utah, a location with genuine historical ties to early Mormon settlement in the region. That grounding gives the expansion a level of specific cultural detail rarely attempted elsewhere in the Fallout franchise. Joshua Graham's backstory as a former high-ranking figure within this community before his fall and transformation into the Burned Man adds further weight to that historical foundation, tying his personal arc directly to questions of faith, forgiveness, and violence. The expansion doesn't treat this religious backdrop as set dressing, instead building entire questlines around genuine theological and philosophical tension between the tribal factions of Xeon and the settlers trying to broker peace among them. That level of specificity required real research into an actual American religious movement, rather than inventing a generic fictional faith from scratch. It remains one of the more quietly ambitious pieces of world-building in the entire Fallout catalog, precisely because of how directly it engages with real history rather than allegory alone. The New River Gorge Bridge made the cut for a reason. So, among the real West Virginia landmarks recreated in Fallout 76, the New River Gorge Bridge stands out as one of the most faithfully rendered. The actual bridge spans roughly 3,030 feet near Fayetteville, West Virginia, with an arch stretching about 1,700 feet, a span that made it the longest single-arc bridge in the world for years after its completion. Its construction also marked the completion of a major stretch of the Appalachian Development Highway system, making it as much an engineering landmark as a scenic one. The bridge's cultural significance in West Virginia runs deep enough that it was chosen for the state's design on the U.S. Mint's 50 State Quarters program in 2005, appearing on the reverse of West Virginia's coin. Given how strongly that bridge is tied to regional identity and pride, its inclusion in Fallout 76 wasn't just a random landmark grab. It functions as one of the clearest visual anchors tying the game's fictional Appalachia back to a real, recognizable piece of West Virginia infrastructure that most residents would immediately recognize. Mothership Zeta's alien conspiracy was almost a much bigger story. Mothership Zeta, the DLC that sends the lone wanderer aboard an actual alien spacecraft, connects back to lore that the very first Fallout game only hinted at in passing. The original 1997 game planted a small suggestion that the pre-war United States government had secretly recovered and exploited captured alien technology, without ever developing the idea much further. According to developer Jeff Gardiner, both he and lead designer Emil Pagliarulo shared a genuine personal interest in alien conspiracy theories, and that shared fascination directly shaped the pitch to build an entire DLC storyline around it. What's less known is that this alien thread was originally meant to run much deeper into the base game itself, tying the abduction of the player's childhood friend Amata's parents and other key story elements, more explicitly into the same conspiracy. Bethesda ultimately hesitated and pulled back from that bigger version of the storyline, leaving only small, uncut remnants scattered throughout the finished game, such as unusual alien power cells found at Fort Bannister and scattered lore tidbits in the official game guide. Mothership Zeta ended up being the place where that abandoned ambition finally got room to breathe, years after the main game had already shipped without it. The Creation Kit modding tools weren't released until 5 months after launch. While Fallout 4 shipped on November 10, 2015, players hoping to build their own mods using Bethesda's official development tools had to wait considerably longer. According to Fallout modding community documentation, the Creation Kit, the free editor that lets players build and share their own content through Bethesda.net, wasn't officially released to the public until April 2016. This meant the game's enormous early modding community spent its first several months working purely with third-party tools and reverse-engineered file formats before Bethesda's own official editor became available. The Creation Kit itself is built as an updated version of the GEC engine tools used for earlier Fallout titles, giving experienced modders from previous games a reasonably familiar starting point once it finally arrived. Its release opened the door to some remarkably ambitious long-term community projects, including total conversion efforts aiming to recreate entire previous Fallout games, like Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas, running natively inside Fallout 4's engine using assets and systems built on top of the newly available toolset. The gap between launch and official mod tool support is a detail easy to overlook now, given how thoroughly mod-friendly Fallout 4 eventually became. But it's a reminder that even one of the most heavily modded games in PC gaming history had its creative floodgates open gradually rather than all at once. Console players had to wait even longer still, since mod support for PlayStation 4 and Xbox One arrived after the PC tools were already established. And there we have it, multiple shocking facts from the Fallout universe to help you unwind and fall asleep. None of the chaos from Fallout has weakened the series. If anything, it's the reason the wasteland feels as lived in and as strange as it does, built by people improvising under pressure instead of executing some grand master plan. If one of these caught you off guard, that's the whole point of digging this deep. Thank you for listening to this video tonight, and we hope it helps you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Until next time, good night.